On today's show, guest host Mari Elena Incapié from Cornell Law School is joined by Jonathan Blitzer, staff writer at The New Yorker, to talk about his recently published book, Everyone Who Is Gone Is Here: The United States, Central America, and the Making of a Crisis. This is a critical and timely conversation, and of course, politically and culturally, a sometimes divisive and contentious topic. Nevertheless, there are hopeful and beautiful stories to share. This conversation touches on the personal immigration stories of our host and guest, while exploring immigration policy, politics, history, and the moral imperative of storytelling. Great writer, great legal expert. This is a fascinating conversation here. Be sure to check out the episode notes also for more information about Cornell Law School's Immigration Law Certificate Program online at eCornell. Now, here's Mari Elena and Jonathan in conversation.
Let's start with this larger question of how did we get to where we are today on immigration? And if you could start, John, by sharing about what did you learn through your research and the writing of the book, and of course through your own journalism, which is woven throughout the book, about how the United States asylum system came into being and how, in particular, U.S. foreign policy in Central America shaped immigration policies.
Like a lot of journalists who really picked up in their work, in my work, in the last several years, a kind of watershed moment was 2014, when there was suddenly a really acute situation, humanitarian situation at the border, where large numbers of people were showing up seeking asylum. Most were coming from the so-called Northern Triangle of Central America. And it was a moment that the Obama administration hadn't anticipated. I don't know that any American administration would have anticipated. And there were sort of a few things that I thought were important to sort of go back in time to try to recover a sense of, in order to better illuminate what the dynamics have been over the last decade plus. And, the first thing is a kind of more general thing. And then we can get into the specifics of asylum policy, which is, concrete and has had obviously very demonstrable consequences over the last several years. The experience I've had as a journalist is I'm always struck, and I've always been struck by this discrepancy between the kind of hard, unbending lines that are presupposed by immigration law or by immigration politics or by the political discourse around both of those things, and the much more complex, interconnected, blurred realities of people's actual lives. And so there's always going to be this fundamental disjunct. And I actually think that's one thing journalistically that reporters ought to and have gotten into, to sort of try to disentangle what these sort of theoretical lines are that govern American immigration policy and the much messier realities. And by messier, I don't mean problematic. I just mean, as a fact of life, people who've, moved between countries, who have families, who've, spread their lives over different countries, have almost woven into their DNA a kind of recognition of how complicated and global this all is. And that doesn't carry through when it comes to lawmakers sorting out the nuts and bolts of these policies. And so, the aim of the book was to look specifically at the relationship between the U.S. and parts of Central America from the 1980s to the present, because until very recently, that was the kind of dominant sort of immigration story in terms of asylum at the U.S. southern border, were Central Americans from El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras coming to the U.S. seeking asylum. And so on the one hand, there is this sort of more cultural question that I want to get into, which is, how do these blurred lines start to first blur? What does it mean that you have generations of people from Central America coming to the United States? What does that legacy mean for their families? What does that legacy mean for the region? How does it start to contribute to a reality that lawmakers can't fully comprehend? So part of that goes to the 1980s, and a lot was going on in the 1980s that I try to capture in the book. You essentially had two things happening simultaneously. You had, on the one hand, the passage of the 1980 Refugee Act, which was the first time, as you know, the first time that the U.S. had codified in an actual statute the protocol for how the U.S. would administer a refugee and asylum program. Prior to that, it was essentially done on an ad hoc basis. When there were international emergencies, a president or a presidential administration would parole in tens of thousands of people or thousands of people, depending on the situation, and eventually their status would be regularized through a series of adjustment acts that Congress would pass. But in 1980, there was a concerted effort to actually systematize the asylum system or practice so that people showing up at the southern border in need of protection because of persecution they faced based on their identity could find that relief. And what happened simultaneously to the passage of that law was that the U.S. was embroiled in the Cold War, obviously all across the world, but specifically in Central America, in ways that brought it very close to military regimes in El Salvador and Guatemala. And what that looked like was the U.S. was providing money, arms, diplomatic cover, military advisors, all of these things to regimes in Central America that were allied with the U.S. in their war against the spread of leftism, the spread of communism. And this created waves of people fleeing for their lives from these countries. And so you had the collision of these two things in the 1980s. You had the existence of this new ethos of asylum law and the reality that tens of thousands of people from Central America were fleeing repression at the hands of U.S. allies. And so you have this immediate contradiction that's kind of baked right into the DNA of asylum practice, which is sort of the original sin of geopolitics, interfering with the kind of ethos and the moral mandate of asylum law. So that's sort of where the story starts, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, thank you for that, John. And I think that one of the things that, again, you do so, like the research, obviously, right? This is like where your journalistic skills come into play. It's just such a fabulous job of documenting both what was happening in Central America, right? As the different characters like Juan Romagosa in particular, that I think about what they were experiencing on the ground, right? Like what was actually happening? What were those push factors that were bringing people throughout Central America and through Mexico and then arriving on the border, and the sanctuary movement that you talk about as well. Can you say a little bit about, I think, just connecting the dots with what was happening in Central America was pushing people and arriving at the border, and anything that you learned that was surprising? I mean, you've been covering immigration for so long, so you are an expert on these issues, but what did you learn through that period about that process?
One general thing is that in the early to mid 1980s, I would say the average grant rate when people sought asylum at the southern border, the average rate at which the U.S. granted asylum was around 20%. But when you had people fleeing from El Salvador and Guatemala, whose specific cases really mapped very plainly onto the statute. I mean, these are legal questions. And so, there are people who could be fleeing for their lives, but for technical reasons, maybe wouldn't qualify for asylum because the type of persecution they're facing isn't the type of persecution that's laid out very specifically in these statutes. But in this case, people fleeing in the 1980s from El Salvador and Guatemala had almost textbook cases of persecution. In other words, the kinds of situations, the kinds of life experiences that U.S. asylum law was very deliberately intended to address. And when it came to Salvadorans and Guatemalans seeking asylum, they were rejected all through the 1980s at rates of 98 and 99%. And the reason for that was that the State Department, which was obviously in charge of prosecuting the Cold War in the wider region, was also presiding over the asylum system. And so to acknowledge that these people were fleeing persecution at the hands of U.S. allies would mean, of course, acknowledging that we had as allies extremely unsavory governments all across the region. For me, one of the really interesting dynamics at that time was you had a group of immigration lawyers and activists who were trying to make sense of the promise of the 1980 Refugee Act. And you had the emergence of the sanctuary movement, which I have to say, I knew about generally, but had not really gotten into the history of prior to researching this book. And it was a revelation to me because this was a group of tens of thousands of Americans all across the country who were kind of united in a sense of almost religious obligation to provide help and relief to Central Americans fleeing for their lives. And the way they did that was they actually helped people cross the border. And one of the reasons why they had to do that was because it was so unclear how the government would treat individual asylum claims. And so there was a real danger that if someone were to present him or herself kind of following the dictates of the 1980 Refugee Act and present themselves to a government agency, they would not see justice. And so this group of activists, ordinary people who did not have a background in immigration law, people in many instances who had very little, prior knowledge of what was happening in Central America, but they themselves got involved at a very grassroots level. And what was always amazing to me was, in the press, they were portrayed, these activists, as being engaged in civil disobedience. But if you were to talk to these activists, What the activists would say is, no, we're not engaging in civil disobedience. Quite the contrary. We're trying to make good on the letter of the law. And it's the Reagan administration at the time that's flouting the actual substance and text of laws that are on the books. So you had all of these things happening at once. And I think, what's most striking to me too, kind of in a historical sense, is, all through the 1980s, you had, just to take the example of El Salvador, roughly a quarter of the Salvadoran population relocate to the United States. I mean, that's an astounding portion of the population. And then when you start to think about what that means for years to come, to say nothing of what it means for that many people to arrive in the United States and to have this very uncertain legal future, which is something we could also talk about. But this is why, to my mind, we can't kind of understand these dynamics at the border or beyond without reference to this history, because these are the antecedents for this deep interconnectedness between the U.S. and countries like El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and other countries in Latin America.
That's right. And I think that one of the things that you talk about in the book is that connection that the sanctuary movement, I mean, today the word sanctuary is used so loosely and has been politicized, but that the sanctuary movement really had its roots in the faith community, right? In the churches that were at the border helping folks out, and also connected to the underground, really linking back to the civil rights movement and the Underground Railroad as well. So thank you for that. We have a question from the audience from someone named Paula. Thank you so much for your question about why, I think just going back to one of the first points you started with, Don, about 2014, Paula was asking, why did this increase happen in 2014? What is your sense of that? And then we'll turn and start talking a little bit about how what happened in the 1980s connects to today as well.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the question. And one of the reasons, I was thinking, as I was mentioning 2014 when we first started talking, I was thinking, okay, I'm committing a kind of cardinal sin here in stepping out of the chronology. An editor will always say to you, like, march through this stuff chronologically. But 2014 to me is an important moment, not just because the sort of asylum challenge at the southern border announced itself in a big national way and was finally sort of recognized as a policy issue and a humanitarian issue that Washington, lawmakers in Washington had to address. But also it was kind of, for all intents and purposes, that's been the dynamic that we've been stuck in ever since, a kind of failure on the part of, lawmakers, and also kind of on a societal level to recognize the needs and the realities of asylum, because that's really been the story all along. So what happens in 2014? It's not a kind of clear through line as to what led to that particular spike at that particular moment in time. But by and large, one of the things that was happening in countries in the northern triangle of Central America was that there was a really overwhelming increase in violence, and that violence was perpetrated by and large by street gangs, and that had become a kind of new dynamic in the region. And it was leading to all sorts of horrific things happening, and people fleeing for their lives because they were getting extorted, they were getting kidnapped, they were getting brutalized. The causes of that gang violence, again, as you can imagine, go far back in time and are quite complex. But again, they run through the United States in an important way. And so, gangs like, now they're such household names. It's sort of surreal to have to think about this. But gangs like MS-13 or El Barrio 18, the 18th Street Gang, these are gangs that sort of in our political discourse, you could be forgiven for thinking that they originated in Central America because of the ways in which American politicians sort of point the finger to Central America as though these countries are the sources of all sorts of criminality. But those gangs actually began on the streets of Los Angeles in the 1980s. And one of the reasons for that was because of a whole set of factors that were unfolding in American cities at the time. You had a kind of ongoing gang war on the streets of South Central Los Angeles during those years. Imagine then washing into that situation large numbers of people from Central America who were kind of newcomers, who were newly vulnerable, who were kind of interlopers in these ongoing, often racialized gang wars on the streets of the city. And over time, an element of primarily Salvadorans who had recently arrived started to form groups almost in self-defense. And these groups over time hardened into actual street gangs. And what happened, if you fast forward into the early 90s, was during a broader crackdown in the United States, where domestic politics, very much the way it is now, actually, kind of traded on this idea that immigration and street crime were connected. and that, being tough on one meant being tough on the other. This was very much the political rhetoric of the 1990s. And it was, by and large, it was the Clinton administration that really, I think, popularized this as a political approach to dealing both with crime and with immigration more generally. But what you had steady deportation of large numbers of Central Americans who had been hardened on the streets of Los Angeles. And during these years of mass deportations of gang members, the United States, for all of its involvement in the region through the 1980s, became a lot less interested in the day-to-day realities of Central America through the 1990s and did next to nothing to prepare the Salvadoran government, for that matter, the Guatemalan government years later, for what it meant that there would be now people arriving who had affiliations that linked them up to, the California penal system. And so over time, those elements started to spread in Central America and really metastasize. And then you fast forward to 2011, 2013, 2014, a lot of the violence you saw during those years was violence wrought by these street gangs, which in Central America, of course, it took on a character of its own. It metastasized and adapted to particular circumstances on the ground in each of these countries. And then you come back to the phenomenon of what it meant to seek asylum. And so you had in the 1980s, people fleeing state repression, showing up at the southern border, seeking asylum, and not getting it for the most part because the United States was implicated in these relationships with military regimes in the region. Then you get to a period like 2014, the asylum statute as such deals with identity-based persecution. The existence of street gangs that were essentially a shadow state that governed life in whole swaths of the region in Central America wasn't something that U.S. law or asylum law had kind of deliberately considered. And so you again had this mismatch of people needing relief and protection and the terms of the law not really being flexible enough to adapt to them.
Yeah, and I remember 2014 very vividly because at the time I was the executive director of the National Immigration Law Center, and we were co-class counsel for the Orantes case, which represented all Salvadorans that arrived at the border. And interviewing some of the mothers that were coming and really noticing for the first time the big demographic change in terms of who was coming and how much gender-based violence and kidnapping and rapes and threats of rapes and gang rapes were happening and forcing so many mothers to take their teenage daughters and go north and take that perilous journey. And it's only, I think just to kind of bring us a little bit to today is, here we are today with increasing numbers, right? In 2014, we were looking at what was happening and grave concerns, both from the advocacy perspective and from government. But then today we're seeing increasing numbers where people from Central America and from other parts of the world feel that they don't have the freedom to stay in their homeland and are making that difficult and dangerous decision to migrate. What would you say is kind of that history of the United States and Central America? What does that teach us about immigration in 2024?
The most general thing is going to sound very obvious, but I think it bears repeating, particularly in 2024, where the kind of narrative line in immigration is as reductive as it'll ever be because of the campaign, the presidential campaign. You can't look at immigration just as a sort of national issue that begins and ends at the U.S. southern border. I feel almost silly saying it because it sounds like it would be so obvious that it would stand to reason, but it obviously doesn't. And, the story of the U.S. and Central America is a particularly fascinating and troubled one, because the conditions in Central America that forced so many people to flee, the U.S. had a hand in creating. So there was a direct through line there between U.S. foreign policy and immigration policy years later, and just the human reality of people having to move and relocate. Now, I would say one of the lessons of that is the U.S. still needs to consider the impact of its foreign policy in the wider world as not just having foreign policy implications, but also having these downstream human consequences that manifest in terms of immigrants showing up in the U.S. And showing up elsewhere who are trying to make better lives for themselves. And so the first point I would say is the U.S. and lawmakers in the U.S. need to be cognizant of the fact of our place in the wider world. The second point related, that these stories don't start at the southern border, and that we should be suspicious anytime we hear from lawmakers or we hear in our kind of political discourse that this problem can be solved by sort of tightening enforcement at the southern border in the absence of doing something else to either modernize the immigration system generally or, improve humanitarian aid in the wider region, whether it's in Latin America or beyond. If someone is boiling this story down to an enforcement question, and specifically an enforcement question at the southern border, that is not the full story. And I actually think that if anything, one of the stories that I take from the relationship between the United States and Central America over all of these years is that an enforcement-only approach can actually backfire, to say nothing of the human fallout and the completely senseless and needless human suffering that results from that. But I also think as a kind of policy matter, this sort of obsession with enforcement at all costs without a kind of wider understanding of the fuller context here does lead to, more chaos at the southern border. And I think on the whole, much more counterproductive outcomes. And then I would say the last thing, and this is maybe another topic we could talk about separately, the asylum system. I think one of the sad facts of how this story has played out, and I feel that, particularly now having spent all of these years working on this book, is that the asylum system has been forced to answer for the wider failures of the American immigration system writ large. The asylum system was only ever designed to protect people who were in need of, of relief as a result of persecution. And it was always going to be a complicated proposition because the asylum system, unlike the refugee program, involves people who show up at the US border seeking protection. And so administratively, it's complicated to deal with a global population that shows up there with very specific needs. But I think over time, and you can imagine, even if you were to take 2014 as the turning point, which I think it, for all intents and purposes, could at least be used as a general benchmark, when you started to see a shift in the profile of people showing up at the southern border from, single adults from Mexico crossing back and forth for work to families seeking asylum. That was one of the ways of understanding that kind of like watershed moment in 2014. But it's now been a decade, and very little has been done to improve the asylum system, even though we know that the world has only gotten more complicated since then. And of course, at the same time, we've done nothing to overhaul the wider immigration system. This just because of the kind of general stupidity of our politics. But because of that, people are left with very few options. And so there are people who are showing up at the southern border who technically wouldn't qualify for asylum, but who nevertheless are showing up at the border because of a real dire and urgent need, whether it's hunger, poverty, desperation of any sort, someone experiencing the ravages of climate change. These are all realities in our world. The asylum system alone can't address that full scope of human need. What could is the immigration system in general. But instead, we're in this sort of loop where lawmakers in Washington say, well, we can't reform the system until we deal with the southern border. But we can't really deal with the southern border in any meaningful sense unless we reform the wider system. And so we're kind of stuck in this bind.
That's right. And I think that, one of the things you said earlier was this piece about people arriving at the border and applying for asylum, and to get to this place where we are today, which is in general, both in the news and in the general, and both politicians are talking this way, and the general understanding is that there are people who are arriving unlawfully at the border. And it's like, no, actually, they are arriving at the border, and that is where you apply for asylum. Like, they're both under US and international law, their right to do so. However, as you just pointed out, a lot of people who are arriving, some will have an asylum claim, a true asylum claim. And then, the question is, do we have the asylum system, the staffing, the adjudicators, the immigration judges, et cetera, to actually give them their fair day in court to be able to get their asylum case forward? Or, for folks that are not eligible for asylum and don't have an asylum claim, what are the other mechanisms for them to come legally? I mean, there just isn't. That is why, again, I think that your book, John, is such an important contribution in this moment, because you're telling that larger global story, as you said, the interconnectedness, the interdependence. And, more and more, it's like everything the United States does on whether it's foreign policy, economic policy. I mean, look at Afghanistan, right? Like, we pulled out of Afghanistan without a plan for what that would do with respect to refugees from Afghanistan. And so one question that I have for you is, I think as you finished your book, now the book just came out in January, and which meant you finished it, over a year ago before publication. What has changed as you see the current day-to-day shifts in immigration? Something's staying the same, something's not, something's getting worse, something's improving.
Yeah.
What are your reflections on where we are today?
Yeah, it's funny. In a certain sense, my book maybe seems timely by virtue of the fact that we're sort of always in the midst of the immigration debate raging in Washington and the sort of, politicians fighting over the border. But I feel self-conscious because my book is about, the US and Central America. And obviously there is so much of the wider immigration system and the US role in the world and the importance of asylum and so on that comes through that story. And, pretty much every aspect of that story is what we live with to this day in terms of like the legal infrastructure that exists and the people involved in all of that. But what started to change in a very specific way is that now the profile of people showing up at the southern border, trying to avail themselves of the asylum system, has become much more global. And so, when I wrote this book, the kind of main, obviously this is to simplify, but the kind of main profile of asylum seeker showing up at the southern border was someone coming from Central America. That was the kind of preponderant profile of a person. Now you've got the world is on fire, and there are people from Africa, Asia, all over South America. The Venezuelan community has exploded at the southern border, coming to the United States seeking relief and protection. So the demographic reality has changed in a major way, even since I was working on this book. That's one thing. An attendant issue related to that is that I really do think it's shown us how acute the needs are just in terms of resources in the asylum system and how unaddressed all of those resource needs have been. So, we've lived essentially for the last decade in the full knowledge of the fact that the asylum system was never sort of built up in an adequate way to address the humanitarian needs of people showing up at the southern border. And for all of the predictable reasons, politics, bureaucracy, general lethargy, there haven't been even some of the more commonsensical measures that could be taken to at least ease aspects of the asylum system. I'm not saying any of those things would have been silver bullets, but certainly things that would have helped make the asylum process function more efficiently. None of those measures have been taken. And what's happened instead all the while is the global needs have intensified. And so it's an incredibly striking thing to see that you spend, as I did in this case for the book, many years working on this project and feeling like, okay, have we sort of taken heed at all of what the needs are and, taking the steps necessary to begin to address some of these systemic problems? And no, we really haven't. And if anything, the political rhetoric has gotten weaponized further. And now we really are at a moment when the numbers, actually right now, the numbers have seemed to decline. And again, I don't want to kind of get caught in this loop too of just talking about the border numbers, which is its own sort of genre of political talk around immigration. The number of people showing up at the border at any given time. Those numbers are going to ebb and flow. But for the most part, there really are huge numbers of people seeking relief in the United States. We're living in a moment of mass migration, the likes of which we haven't seen since the Second World War. And so it puts even more stress on a system that is just really kind of fatally underserved by lawmakers in Washington. I think one of the biggest shifts that I've noticed recently that has really changed the politics in a way that's striking has been what the governor of Texas has done in busing asylum seekers to blue cities across the country. I am shocked by, that approach for its cynicism is shocking in its own right. But the fallout of that, which is to say, now you have blue cities, Denver, Chicago, Washington, D.C., that really are overwhelmed. There's no denying it. There are large numbers of people who are here who need help and resources and relief. And, cities and states aren't fully prepared to provide that relief. And it has not helped that the busing of migrants to these cities has been done specifically with the aim of causing chaos. There was no coordination involved, no effort to deal systematically with this. You've watched, as this has happened, you've watched Democrats start to move farther and farther to the right. And so some of the things that, toward the tail end of the writing of this book, there were things that the Trump administration, policies the Trump administration had pursued that I think it's fair to say Democrats on the whole considered unconscionable. And now, fast forward a few years, some of the policies that seemed so draconian and, over the top during the Trump years are not so far from the minds of desperate Democrats. I'm thinking, for example, about this notion of shutting down the border. The idea that this has become a kind of fixture in our political conversation is pretty stunning. And that's happened in short order. It's been incredible to see the conversation really shift to the right in demonstrable ways in such a short period of time.
That's right. And I think that the politicization, if that's a word, of on both sides, right? And even having, as you said, mayors of blue cities talking about migrants potentially ruining the city of the most immigrant rich city in the world of New York, adds to that rather than it's about the frustration on all sides of the political spectrum rather than really talking about solutions. And so one question that has come up from the audience is, what recommendations do you've now learned so much about both the kind of the roots, how the asylum system was put into place, what had contributed to people coming from Central America, what's happening when people arrive at the border? Any thoughts about what you would do to improve the asylum system now? I think, one of the things you talked about is the need for some major, major reform on asylum.
Yeah, I always feel so overwhelmed by these questions because I'm certainly not a policy expert. And I'm not even sure that policy experts have a clear sense at this point of sort of what the best course forward is. In a world in which politics were not such an impediment, I would say there are a couple of things that I at least hear when I talk to people who I consider really expert in these issues. I hear certain patterns and sort of themes that recur. So they're on my mind. Mm-hmm. One is, and again, they're all going to sort of sound obvious, which is maybe the point. Acknowledging the fact that the majority of people showing up at the southern border seeking asylum, assuming that they're able to actually lodge their asylum claim, which is far from assured these days. I mean, it could be years before someone actually gets a chance to present that claim before a judge. But assuming that they do, as we've discussed already, a lot of people do not have a strong claim based on the technical elements that are laid out in the law as such. So that really puts a premium on developing other legal pathways for people to come to the United States that are outside the asylum system. And so I really personally believe that asylum is worth saving. I think it's a foundational ethos in this country. I think it makes sense in kind of every regard, on a policy level, on a human level, on a diplomatic level. But I think one of the ways of trying to save the asylum system is to actually build out other aspects of the immigration system that could reduce some of the pressure and remove some of that pressure at the southern border. And, this has not been worked out fully. But something that I've kept my eye on just as a journalist during the sort of last couple of years of the Biden administration have been how the administration has tried to make use of its parole authority to target specifically people coming from Venezuela, Haiti, Cuba, and Nicaragua. 4 populations that you're seeing rates of emigration that are really quite high from these countries. And one of the things that the Biden administration has done in these instances is it's created a parole program whereby people from these countries can apply to come to the United States through parole and will arrive in the United States. Now, there are all kinds of questions about what happens to them once they arrive in the United States. And this is where having a dysfunctional Congress does not help matters. But what's interesting to me is in the first year of this particular parole program involving these 4 countries, and again, the way the Biden administration has used this parole program, it's circumscribed in all sorts of ways. I mean, this is an executive acting unilaterally because Congress hasn't done anything. There are significant political headwinds. There have been lawsuits filed by Republican attorneys general. So, I'm not trying to either make light of the things that this parole program has been up against, nor am I trying to make it seem like this is ideal by any measure, but I want to tease out the kind of idea of it. The year after this parole program was put in place, 90% of border arrivals from those 4 countries dropped, which is significant. And it shows you that people will avail themselves of legal channels if they're extended.
Right. I mean, I think that's one of the challenges, right, is that there haven't been legal channels, right? I mean, any rational person is going to prefer to have a way to apply to come here rather than walking with their children for 5, 10, 20, 30 days and being subjected to rape, theft, kidnapping, right? Just, so many cruelties as well. Don, we're coming up against the end of our time. And so I wanted to shift a little bit to the personal again, which is really more about, look, at the end of the day, all of these policies, whether we're talking about asylum laws or immigration writ large in the United States or in any other country, it's about human mobility, right? It's because people are either feeling the need to move, whether it's for love, for joy, for art, for employment and educational opportunities, or because they're fleeing, right, the situations that they're dealing with and seeking safety and freedom, in this case, in the United States. And so, but at the end of the day, we're talking about people, human beings. And so the question that I have for you to wrap up is, could you share what it means, right, to tell someone else's story as a journalist? And then here you did so as an author, right, weaving in your journalism skills and bringing to life beautiful, complex characters. So share a little bit more about what that experience has been like.
Yeah, thanks. It's funny. Because of the kind of weightier issues associated with this from a kind of policy standpoint, I spend a lot of time talking about that stuff, but really, what for me, the whole sort of impetus for doing this has been from the start are the people at the center of this book. And I've really learned the history and the policy from them. And I've kind of built around them and their lives. And they have been my entry point into all of this. And so the kind of the research and the reporting are almost like concentric circles that I start to draw around these people who become quite close to me. I take the responsibility of telling someone else's story extremely seriously. I mean, it is the kind of thing that keeps me up at night. It's also the kind of thing that I wake up in the morning most excited to do. And, one of the kind of core premises of this book is that the main figures in it, their voices, their sensibility, their lives, their perspectives, I wanted to expose readers to them. And there are a whole set of journalistic tools I can use to make sure that you as a reader have the most direct experience of them as I can facilitate. And so what it's meant in each of these cases is a relationship I've developed with all of the main figures in this book over the course of years. Eddie Anzora is one of the main figures in the book. I've known Eddie since 2016. Keldy, who appears later in the book, I met in 2018. Juan Romagosa, who's kind of the beating heart of the book. We spent the first couple of years of our friendship on the phone every day for an hour, for years. And so the only way really kind of narratively to move into their lives in a way that's meaningful is to just spend sustained periods of time with them, talking to them, hearing their thoughts, learning from them, letting them correct me, having them insist on things, going back and forth. I really, in many ways, see it as a collaboration in that sense. And that has been the most rewarding and gratifying aspect of this work by a mile.
Thanks for listening to Cornell Keynotes. Check out the episode notes for more information on Cornell University's Immigration Law Certificate Program at eCornell. Thanks again, friends, and be sure to subscribe to stay in touch.